It was a beautiful morning, and the lobby of Newcastle National Bank was bustling with activity. Employees dressed in sharp suits moved briskly behind the polished counters, attending to clients and managing transactions with practiced efficiency. The atmosphere was a mix of quiet professionalism and the occasional sound of murmured conversations. Meanwhile, customers, some impatient, others simply passing time, waited in line, their faces a reflection of the busy day ahead. Some checked their watches, others flipped through magazines, and a few stared absent-mindedly at the digital clocks mounted on the wall as they waited for their turn. Before we dive into this beautiful story, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more of these wonderful stories. Among them was Bob, an elderly black man with a weathered face and a kind smile. His neatly pressed suit was simple yet dignified, and he carried a briefcase that looked like it had seen years of use. Bob walked at a deliberate pace, his cane tapping softly against the marble floors. As Bob approached the counter, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift slightly. Two employees, Susan and Mark, both in their mid-30s, exchanged a glance. Their polished demeanor faltered for a moment, and a subtle frown crept onto Susan's face. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, her tone clipped as Bob stepped forward. "Yes, young lady," Bob replied with a polite smile. "I'd like some assistance with my account." Mark, who was standing nearby, leaned in and whispered something to Susan, just barely audible to the other customers. "Another one of those time wasters," he muttered under his breath. Susan sighed loudly, her impatience visible as she eyed Bob up and down. "Do you even have an account here?" she asked, her words dripping with condescension. Bob remained calm, his smile unwavering. "Yes, ma'am, I do. Been a customer here for over 20 years. "Right," Susan replied skeptically. "Well, we'll need to see some ID." Bob reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his identification with steady hands. Susan took it and squinted at it, her expression remaining dubious. "You sure this is your account?" Mark interjected, stepping closer. "We've had some incidents before." Bob raised an eyebrow, but kept his tone calm. "I'm certain, young man. I've been banking here since before you started working." The subtle remark didn't sit well with Mark, who scoffed and muttered, "Some people think they can just walk in here and waste our time." Susan, emboldened by Mark's attitude, pushed the ID back across the counter. "Look, sir, we're very busy today. Maybe you should come back when you're more prepared." Bob's expression remained composed, though a flicker of disappointment passed through his eyes. "I am prepared," he said softly. "I'd appreciate it if you could check my account." Instead of responding, Susan motioned to a security guard standing near the entrance. The guard, a burly man with a stern face, walked over, his presence adding an unnecessary layer of intimidation. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice firm. "No problem," Bob said evenly. "I'm just trying to access my account." Susan leaned over and whispered something to the guard, who nodded curtly. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave for today," the guard said, gesturing toward the door. Bob stood still for a moment, his grip tightening slightly on his cane. The room seemed to grow quieter as other customers took notice of the scene. Without raising his voice, Bob replied, "Are you asking me to leave without resolving my business here?" "Yes," Susan said bluntly. "You're holding up the line." Bob looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he turned and began to walk toward the exit, his cane tapping softly once again. The door closed behind him, leaving the employees to resume their work, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Bob patiently approached the reception desk, where a young man, barely in his mid-20s, sat scrolling through his phone. His name tag read Ethan. Without looking up, Ethan gestured dismissively and said, "Yes, what do you need?" Bob offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon. I was wondering if I could speak to someone about opening a corporate account. I have some business matters to discuss." Ethan finally looked up, his expression immediately turning cold. He scanned Bob's appearance, the slightly worn coat, the old-fashioned hat, the absence of a briefcase or luxury watch, and his face twisted into a smirk. "Corporate account? "You sure you're in the right place, sir?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Bob didn't let the jab faze him. "Yes, I'm sure. I'd like to speak to a manager if possible." Before Ethan could respond, a second employee, a woman named Mary, walked by and overheard the conversation. She glanced at Bob, then leaned in to whisper to Ethan. "Does he look like someone who could even afford a corporate account? Probably just wasting our time." Bob caught the remark, but chose to remain composed. He repeated his request, this time addressing both of them. "I'd appreciate it if someone could assist me. I have all the necessary documents with me." Ethan exchanged a glance with Mary and rolled his eyes. "Look, sir," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "This is a high-end financial institution. We don't have time for, well, whatever it is you're trying to do here." The sharpness in Ethan's tone drew the attention of other customers and staff nearby. Some whispered among themselves, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. Mary decided to escalate the situation. She stepped forward, her voice firm but condescending. "Sir, we have policies in place. Without an appointment and proper credentials, we can't entertain requests like yours. And frankly, this branch handles clients of a certain caliber." The words stung, but Bob maintained his composure. "I understand policies, and I respect them. However, I believe if you take a moment to review my paperwork, you'll see that I meet the requirements." Mary let out a short laugh. "Paperwork? You're kidding, right?" she said. "Sir, I think it's best if you take your business elsewhere. We're quite busy here." By now, a small crowd had formed. Some customers stared in disbelief at the way Bob was being treated, while others averted their gaze, unwilling to intervene. A middle-aged woman whispered to her companion, "Why are they treating him like that? He hasn't done anything wrong." Ethan, sensing the growing tension, decided to end the interaction. "All right, that's enough," he said loudly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disrupting the workflow here." Bob hesitated, glancing around at the onlookers. His calm demeanor never wavered, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded document. "Perhaps if you look at this, it might clear up any misunderstandings." Ethan barely glanced at the paper before pushing it back toward Bob. "Leave," he said. "We don't have time for this." Mary nodded in agreement, stepping closer to Bob. As if to physically usher him out, Ethan said, "This isn't the place for you." At that moment, a third employee, a junior banker named Mia, stepped forward hesitantly. She had been watching the interaction from her desk and felt uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. "Maybe we should just take a look at his documents," Mia suggested softly, addressing Ethan and Mary. "It won't hurt to check." Ethan shot her a glare. "Mia, stay out of this. We know what we're doing." But Mia persisted, her voice firmer this time. "He's not causing any trouble. He's just asking for assistance. Isn't that our job?" Mary turned to Mia with an icy tone. "Mia, if you want to waste your time, go ahead. But don't expect us to entertain every random person who thinks they can walk in here and open a corporate account." The tension in the room was thick. Sensing the hostility, Bob decided to step back. "It's all right," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause a scene. I'll take my business elsewhere." He turned to leave, his steps slow but dignified. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment and glanced back at the staff who had dismissed him so quickly. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet sadness. Without saying another word, he walked out into the cold afternoon, leaving behind the murmurs of onlookers. Inside, Ethan and Mary exchanged smug smiles, proud of how they had handled the situation. "People like him think they can just walk in and demand attention," Ethan muttered under his breath. Mia, however, felt a knot of unease in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. The weeks following Bob's decision to enroll the two bankers, Rosemary and Patrick, in anti-racism therapy were a whirlwind of introspection, education, and transformation. At first, both employees approached the therapy sessions with reluctance and skepticism. They saw it as an unnecessary punishment, a humiliation in front of their peers. But Bob, with his calm and steady demeanor, had anticipated this reaction. "I'm not punishing you," He had said the day he handed them their notices of mandatory participation. This is an opportunity, a chance for you to see the world through a lens you've been avoiding. It's not about shaming you, it's about expanding your mind and heart. Rosemary couldn't stop thinking about those words. During the first session, she had always considered herself someone who treated everyone the same. But the sessions challenged her to confront her biases. The therapy was structured to push participants out of their comfort zones, starting with storytelling sessions where people from various racial and cultural backgrounds shared their lived experiences. One afternoon, during a particularly powerful session, a young Black woman named Danielle spoke about a time she was refused a home loan despite having impeccable credit. Her voice trembled as she recounted how the denial had crushed her dreams of owning her first home. It wasn't just about the loan, Danielle said. It was about being told, in so many words, that I wasn't good enough, that no matter how hard I worked, someone would always see me as less. Rosemary found herself wiping away tears. For the first time, she truly understood how the systems she had upheld, consciously or not, could devastate lives. She thought back to the way she had treated Bob. Though she hadn't said anything overtly racist, her actions had spoken volumes. She had dismissed him as unworthy of her respect, based solely on his appearance. Patrick's journey was no less impactful. His natural defensiveness made the first few sessions difficult. He was quick to interrupt, to justify his actions, and to point out times when he believed he had. As the sessions progressed, Patrick's walls began to crumble. One day, the therapist asked the group to participate in a role reversal exercise. Patrick was paired with a Black man named Harold, who played the role of a banker while Patrick acted as the customer. Harold treated Patrick with the same coldness and disdain Patrick had often shown to others, adding an air of condescension that hit Patrick like a punch to the gut. "That's what it feels like," Harold said afterward, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "That's what so many of us feel every day, like we're less than just because of the color of our skin." For the first time, Patrick couldn't speak. He felt the sting of prejudice, even if only in a simulated environment. It was a wake-up call he couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, both Rosemary and Patrick began to change, not just in how they viewed the world, but in how they saw themselves. They started to recognize their privilege, their blind spots, and the harm they had caused, both intentionally and unintentionally. The therapy sessions were difficult and often uncomfortable, but they were also deeply transformative. Bob, though not directly involved in the sessions, kept tabs on their progress. He received weekly reports from the program facilitators and even attended a few group sessions as a silent observer. Seeing Rosemary and Patrick's vulnerability and willingness to change filled him with cautious hope. When the therapy program concluded, Rosemary and Patrick requested a private meeting with Bob. They walked into his office, their postures humble and their expressions earnest. "Mr. Reynolds," Rosemary began, her voice trembling, "we owe you an apology, not just for how we treated you that day, but for the attitudes and biases we've carried for so long. The therapy opened our eyes to things we didn't want to see about ourselves. We were wrong. So wrong. And we're so sorry." Patrick nodded, his usual confident demeanor replaced with genuine humility. "I thought I understood people, but I didn't. I judged you without knowing anything about you. And worse, I justified it to myself. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when you had every reason to." Bob looked at them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a small smile, he said, "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, but the real work begins now. Change isn't about words, it's about actions. Show me and yourselves that you've learned from this." Rosemary and Patrick nodded, their resolve clear. Several months later, Bob decided to host a small gathering at the bank to celebrate the progress Rosemary and Patrick had made. It was a simple affair, just a few employees, some snacks, and a chance to reflect on the journey they had all been part of. During the gathering, Rosemary and Patrick shared their experiences with the group, speaking openly about their past mistakes and the lessons they had learned. Their vulnerability inspired others in the room to reflect on their own biases and behaviors, sparking a candid and meaningful conversation about diversity and inclusion. Bob watched with pride as his employees engaged in the discussion, their words filled with empathy and a genuine desire to create a more inclusive workplace. It was a far cry from the hostility he had faced on his first visit to the bank. Toward the end of the evening, Rosemary and Patrick approached Bob. "We wanted to thank you," Rosemary said, her eyes shining with sincerity. "Not just for giving us a second chance, but for teaching us what leadership really means. You didn't just tell us to change, you showed us how." Patrick added, "You believed in us when we didn't deserve it. That's a lesson I'll carry with me." Bob smiled, his heart full. "The best way you can thank me is by continuing to grow and by helping others do the same. Change doesn't stop here." The events at the bank became a turning point, not just for Rosemary and Patrick, but for the entire institution. Bob implemented new diversity and inclusion training programs, ensuring that all employees, from entry-level staff to top executives, understood the importance of empathy and respect. Rosemary and Patrick became champions of these initiatives, using their own experiences as powerful examples of how change is possible. They mentored new employees, shared their stories at company events, and worked tirelessly to create a workplace where everyone felt valued. For Bob, the journey had been about more than just addressing a single incident of discrimination. It had been about planting seeds of change, showing that even the most deeply ingrained biases could be overcome with humility, education, and a willingness to grow. In the end, the greatest reward was seeing those seeds bear fruit, a team united by respect, a workplace transformed by understanding, and a legacy of leadership that would endure for years to come.